A little girl with baby shivering, abandoned under a bridge. Then a millionaire CEO saw and did this. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold, rainy night in the city, the world moved on as usual. The sidewalks were busy with people, heads down, trying to get to their destinations. But beneath a bridge, away from the warmth of the bustling streets, something was happening that would change the lives of two people forever. A little girl, no older than 6, was crouched down, her small frame trembling violently in the chill. She was holding her baby sister tightly, the only warmth between them. Their clothes were soaked, their faces pale, and their tiny bodies were shivering uncontrollably. The bridge offered no shelter from the cold wind, and their situation seemed hopeless. The baby, barely a few months old, was crying softly in her sister's arms, but there was no one to hear their desperate pleas. The girl whispered over and over, "Please, don't let them take her." It wasn't clear who they were, but it was obvious that whatever had happened to these children, they were terrified. Just then, a car slowed down, and the headlights illuminated the cold, grim scene under the bridge. The driver, a lonely millionaire CEO named Thomas, had been driving home from a long day of meetings, his mind weighed down with the stress of running his successful business empire. But as he passed the bridge, something caught his eye, a flash of movement in the shadows. His instincts told him to keep driving, but for some reason, he couldn't. He stopped the car and got out, feeling the sharp bite of the cold air. As he approached the two small figures huddling under the bridge, his heart sank. He could see their fear, their desperation. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. Her words, barely a whisper, cut through the night. "Please don't take us back." Thomas didn't know what to do at first. His life was filled with meetings, power plays, and endless demands, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. He crouched down to their level, feeling the icy chill in the air as he reached out to the girl. He knew this wasn't just some ordinary situation. This was something that required more than just money or influence. It required compassion. He gently picked up the baby girl from her sister's arms, cradling her close to his chest. The little girl, still trembling, looked at him with wide, trusting eyes. He could feel the weight of their fear and pain. He couldn't leave them there. He couldn't let them suffer any longer. Without thinking twice, he wrapped his coat around both girls, picked them up, and walked them to his car. He promised them, "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." In that moment, something inside Thomas shifted. The cold, hard walls he had built around his heart began to crack. He wasn't just saving these children from the cold. He was saving himself too. As Thomas drove the car, the rain beat steadily against the windshield, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the heavy thoughts in his mind. The two girls sat in the back seat, still shivering, but now wrapped in his coat, their tiny hands clutching the fabric like it was their lifeline. The baby girl, still quiet, was nestled safely in his arms. He glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing the little girl watching him intently, her eyes filled with fear and something else he couldn't quite place, trust. He had no idea what he was doing, no plan in place, but he knew he couldn't leave them in the streets. "What happened to you?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. The little girl, who he had learned was named Lily, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We had no place to go. Mommy's sick, and we ran away," she said, her voice so small, so fragile. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard of the kind of neglect that left children out on the streets, but hearing it firsthand made it real, made it impossible to ignore. The drive to the hospital seemed to stretch on forever. The roads were slick with rain, and Thomas's mind raced. He had built an empire from the ground up, yet here he was, holding a baby girl in his arms, trying to save her from a fate he couldn't fully understand. His life had been about control, about numbers, deals, and power, but none of that seemed to matter in this moment. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a man with a heart that couldn't turn away. The car eventually pulled up to the emergency entrance of the nearest hospital. Without hesitation, Thomas got out, cradling Lily in his arms and holding the baby close. The cool air hit his face as he hurried into the building, past the automatic doors, and straight to the nearest nurse. "Please help," he said, his voice urgent but shaken. The nurse looked at him, then at the girls, and immediately sprang into action. She ushered them into a room, and within moments, doctors and nurses were assessing the situation. Lily, her small face pale and tired, didn't say much. She simply clutched her baby sister, looking up at Thomas with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It was then that Thomas realized the full extent of the situation. These children were alone, not just in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered. They had no one. He had no one. His empire of wealth and success had given him everything, except the one thing that truly mattered: connection. As he stood there, waiting, the silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. A nurse came over, checking on the baby, and Lily looked at Thomas again. Her voice was soft but steady. "Will we be okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of reassurance. Thomas swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. "I'll make sure you are," he promised, though even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he could keep them. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: vulnerability. But it wasn't just for himself. It was for these two little girls, who had nowhere to go. He was the one who could change that. He didn't know how, but he knew he wouldn't leave them. He wouldn't let them slip through his fingers. Not now. As the hours passed in the hospital, the rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, and the harshness of the night seemed to calm. Thomas sat in the sterile waiting room, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. His mind was a whirlwind, thoughts racing in every direction. He couldn't shake the image of Lily's eyes, the way they had looked at him with a silent trust, as though she was placing the weight of her life in his hands. He had no idea what to do, how to help, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away. The doctors had told him that the baby, whom Lily had named Grace, was stable for now. They had seen worse, but it was clear that these children were in more than just physical danger. They were broken in a way that made Thomas's heart ache. The cold, the hunger, and the fear that had been their constant companions, they were all visible in the way they clung to each other. It was clear to him now that they were not just abandoned, they were lost. And somehow, he was the one who had found them. After a few hours, a nurse came out to speak with him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "the children are doing better. They're resting now." Thomas nodded, his heart lightened by the news. "Can I see them?" he asked. The nurse hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, guiding him through the corridors. As they approached the room, he could see Lily sitting on the edge of the bed, her small figure hunched over. She had her baby sister cradled in her arms, her gaze fixed on the tiny face, eyes full of worry. Thomas stepped inside quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile moment. Lily looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time since he had found them, there was a hint of a smile. It was small, hesitant, but it was there. "How is she?" Thomas asked, his voice soft, his hands trembling just a little. "She's sleeping now," Lily replied in a quiet voice. "I think she'll be okay. I just wanted to keep her safe." Thomas walked over to the bed, standing beside them. The bond between the two girls was unbreakable, and he could see how much Lily had taken on her young shoulders. She was trying to protect her sister, to be the adult, in a world that had failed them. "You did a good job, Lily," Thomas said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You kept her safe, and you brought her here. You're stronger than you know." Lily looked up at him, her eyes still full of that silent trust. "What will happen to us now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas felt his heart tighten. He knew that, in this moment, her fate was in his hands. He could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. But for the first time in years, he didn't shy away from it. He was used to making hard decisions, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal. This was a life. This was a family. "You're not alone anymore," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "I'm going to take care of you both. You'll be safe with me, and I'm going to make sure you have everything you need." The room was silent for a moment as Lily processed his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It was like a door he hadn't known existed had opened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He had saved many businesses, many deals, but this was different. This was a family, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Days passed, and the sense of uncertainty that had once gripped Thomas began to dissipate. The quiet hum of his luxurious office, the constant buzz of business calls, and the rigid schedule he had once clung to seemed to fade into the background. His thoughts no longer revolved solely around his company, its profits, or its global expansion. Instead, they now centered on Lily and Grace. The girls were adjusting to their new life, and so was Thomas, in ways he never imagined. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, and he found himself unsure of how to navigate this new world of fatherhood. The first few weeks were filled with simple, yet profound moments. Like when Lily hesitated before asking to sit at the dinner table, unsure if it was really okay. Or when Grace, who had barely spoken a word since they met, smiled for the first time in Thomas's presence. That smile was everything. It was the kind of smile that made him feel like he was finally doing something right, even if he didn't have all the answers. But the challenge wasn't just about providing for them physically. It was about earning their trust, about proving to them that they were safe. They had been through so much, and Thomas knew it would take time. He couldn't fix everything in a day, but he was committed to doing whatever it took. It was during a weekend outing to a local park when Thomas realized just how far they had come. The sun was shining brightly, and the park was filled with children running and playing, their laughter ringing in the air. Lily and Grace were holding hands, walking ahead of him, their small figures visible among the other families enjoying the day. Lily, once so reserved and cautious, was now smiling, laughing even. Grace, her baby sister, was running around with a group of kids, giggling as they chased each other. For the first time, they looked like any other children, free from fear, free from the weight of their past. Thomas stood off to the side, watching them, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't just the warmth of the sun or the peacefulness of the park. It was something deeper. It was the realization that they were healing, that they were becoming a family. And he was a part of that. As the day wore on, they all sat together on a blanket, eating sandwiches and sharing stories. It was a simple moment, but for Thomas, it felt like a triumph. He had brought these two girls from the darkness, from the cold, and now they were sitting in the light, surrounded by laughter and warmth. The bond they had built over these few weeks had become unbreakable. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Thomas realized something. The girls were no longer just in need of a home. They were the home he had been searching for all along. They had given him something he had lost years ago, a sense of purpose, of belonging. And now, with every passing day, they were giving each other the chance to heal. As the day came to a close, and they headed back to the car, Lily turned to him and asked, "Do you think we'll be okay, Daddy?" Thomas's heart swelled with emotion as he looked at her. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "we will be. We're okay now." And for the first time in a long time, Thomas believed it. The days after their trip to the park were filled with small, yet significant moments. Thomas found himself adjusting more to his new role as a father than he ever thought possible. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when he questioned if he was doing enough or if he was truly capable of raising these two girls. But every time he saw them smile, every time he heard their laughter, he knew he was on the right path. Lily had become more open, more willing to trust him with her fears, her worries. She no longer hid behind her walls, and while she was still cautious, she had begun to blossom in a way that brought a sense of pride to Thomas's heart. Grace, on the other hand, was more energetic than ever. She ran through the house, filled with joy, her laughter ringing through the halls like a melody that was finally being played. There were still moments when she would cling to Thomas, especially at night when the house was quiet and the shadows seemed to loom a little too large. But he would always hold her, whispering comforting words, assuring her that she was safe. One evening, after dinner, Thomas sat with both girls on the couch, the television casting a soft light in the room. Lily was sitting beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, and Grace was sprawled out at their feet, her eyes heavy with sleep. It was a quiet evening, but it felt like everything was finally coming together. As Thomas looked down at them, he realized just how much they had become a part of his life, just how much they had healed him in return. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had lost until he found them. Lily's quiet resilience and Grace's innocent joy had brought back pieces of him he didn't even know were missing. He had been so focused on building an empire that he had neglected the things that truly mattered: love, connection, family. The doorbell suddenly rang, interrupting his thoughts. Thomas frowned, not expecting anyone. He stood up, brushing off his suit jacket, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was met with the sight of a man he hadn't seen in years, his estranged brother, Aaron. Aaron stood there, his face a mixture of uncertainty and guilt. "Thomas," he began, his voice low, "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I've heard about what happened. About the girls. And I just wanted to apologize." Thomas felt a surge of emotions he couldn't quite place. His brother had been absent for so many years, leaving him to deal with their parents' passing and the aftermath of their broken family. And now, here he was, standing at his doorstep, asking for forgiveness. Thomas didn't know how to react. "You can't just show up after all this time and expect forgiveness," he said, his voice harsh. But then he looked over at Lily and Grace, both of them now sitting on the couch, watching him with innocent eyes. They had been through so much, and they had learned to trust him. He couldn't just turn Aaron away, not when he had promised to build a family with these girls. "Come in," Thomas finally said, his voice softening. "We'll talk." As Aaron stepped inside, Thomas realized something. Family wasn't just about the people who were always there. It was about the people you chose to care for. It was about the relationships you built, the trust you earned, and the love you gave. His life had been forever changed by Lily and Grace, and now, he had a chance to rebuild another piece of his family. It wasn't going to be easy. But as he closed the door behind his brother, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He was not the same man who had walked into that hospital weeks ago. He was stronger, more whole, and more ready than ever to face whatever challenges came next. As the weeks went by, the awkwardness of Aaron's sudden appearance began to fade. He had apologized for his absence, and Thomas, despite his reservations, had allowed him back into his life. Slowly, Aaron started to prove himself, showing up for family dinners and taking an interest in Lily and Grace. It wasn't easy, and trust wasn't built overnight, but there was progress. Lily had started to warm up to him, slowly but surely. She had questions, of course, about why her uncle had been absent for so long, but she didn't ask them out loud. She simply watched, observed, and tested the waters. Thomas watched the quiet exchanges between them, knowing that healing wasn't always about big gestures. Sometimes it was about the small, everyday actions that built trust over time. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas took Lily and Grace to their favorite park. It had become a place where they could escape from the worries of the world and just be children again. As they walked along the path, Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, do you think Uncle Aaron is really sorry for leaving us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked down at her, surprised by the question, but grateful that she felt comfortable enough to ask. "I think he's trying, sweetheart," Thomas said softly. "It's going to take time, but we're all trying to make things right." Lily nodded, her small face serious, and then smiled. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I believe you." As they continued to walk, Grace ran ahead, laughing and chasing a butterfly. The sound of her laughter filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. He watched his daughters, these two little girls who had once been so lost, now running freely, filled with joy and innocence. He knew that they had found something they had longed for: stability, love, and safety. And as they spent that afternoon together, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, Thomas realized that this was his family. Not just the family he had been born into, but the family he had chosen. The family he was building, piece by piece, with every small act of love and commitment. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, the atmosphere in the house was different. The tension that had once hung in the air was now replaced with laughter and lightness. Aaron had come over earlier in the day to spend time with them, and although it was still a bit awkward, it was clear that they were making progress. He was learning, slowly but surely, how to be a part of this family. And Lily and Grace, though still cautious, at times, were starting to see their uncle in a new light. As they all sat around the table, Thomas looked around at the faces of the people he loved, his daughters, his brother, and even himself. In a way, he had never imagined his life would turn out like this. He had never imagined he would find himself here, sitting in a warm home, surrounded by the people he cared about most. But life had a way of surprising him. The love he had for these two girls was not just a fleeting emotion. It was something deep and unbreakable. And as he watched them eat, laugh, and talk, he knew one thing for sure. This was where he was meant to be. It had been a few months since Aaron's return, and though the road to rebuilding their family was still a work in progress, Thomas felt a shift, a warmth that wasn't there before. The days had settled into a rhythm that felt more like home than anything he had ever experienced. Lily and Grace were flourishing in ways he couldn't have predicted. The once distant and guarded Lily had transformed into a bright, curious girl who asked questions, laughed freely, and even showed signs of leadership, guiding her younger sister in their little games. Grace, on the other hand, was blossoming into the vibrant, playful child that Thomas had hoped she would become. She had become more confident, and though she still clung to him sometimes at night, she had learned to trust that he would always be there. One afternoon, as Thomas sat in his study, he received a call that he didn't expect. It was from the social worker who had been assigned to their case. The last few months had been about building a new life for the girls, and with Aaron's gradual involvement, it seemed that things were heading in the right direction. However, the social worker had some news that caught him off guard. "Mr. Caldwell," the social worker said, "we've received some information. It seems that Lily and Grace's biological mother is asking to see them." Thomas froze, his grip tightening on the phone. He had always known that the girls had come from a troubled past, but the idea that their mother, who had abandoned them, wanted to see them now was a complication he wasn't prepared for. "What does that mean for them?" he asked, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "It means that we have to give them the option," the social worker replied gently. "We can't stop the process. They have the right to know about their past, but we also need to consider their emotional well-being." The conversation continued, but Thomas couldn't focus on the words. He was lost in thought. He hadn't anticipated this. He had promised the girls that they were safe now, that their past was behind them. But now, their past was knocking at the door. When he hung up the phone, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his hands pressed together in front of his face. He thought about Lily and Grace, about the little girls who had come into his life so unexpectedly. They had already suffered so much. They had been through more than any child should ever endure, and now, the possibility of reopening old wounds hung in the air. That evening, after dinner, he sat down with Lily and Grace in the living room. He looked at them, the two of them so full of life, their eyes shining with innocence and hope. "I need to talk to you both about something important," he began, his voice softer than usual. Lily, who had grown so used to their family dynamic, looked up at him with curiosity. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked. Thomas took a deep breath. He had to be honest with them. He couldn't protect them from everything, but he could guide them. "Your mom, the one who left you, she's asking to see you," he said, his words hanging heavily in the room. Lily's eyes widened. Grace, who had been drawing on the floor, stopped and looked up. It was clear that neither of them fully understood the weight of what he was saying. Thomas continued, "I don't want you to feel confused. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. But I also want you to know that you have the choice to see her, if you want to. It's up to you." There was silence for a moment, and then Lily spoke softly, her voice steady but uncertain. "What if we don't want to see her?" Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Then you don't have to. You're safe here, with me. That's all that matters." Grace crawled over to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs. Thomas knelt down, pulling her into his arms, and Lily followed, resting her head on his shoulder. In that moment, Thomas realized that this was what family was, choosing each other, no matter what the past held. No matter what they faced in the future, they were together, and that was enough. The following weeks were filled with contemplation and decision-making. Thomas had made it clear to Lily and Grace that they were safe, that their past would not define them, and that no matter what, they had a choice. But as much as he reassured them, he couldn't ignore the weight of the situation himself. He had been thrust into fatherhood in a way that no one could have predicted, and now he was faced with the question of what role the girl's biological mother would play in their lives, if any. It was a question that gnawed at him. He had promised the girls a future free from fear and abandonment, and now he was worried that allowing their mother into their lives would undo all the progress they had made. Yet, He knew that he couldn't shield them from the reality of their past forever. They had a right to know. It was a Saturday morning when the decision finally came to a head. Thomas had spent the morning running errands, picking up groceries, and handling the small tasks that had become part of his new routine. As he returned home, he noticed Lily and Grace sitting at the kitchen table, talking quietly to each other. The mood in the house was calm, but there was an unspoken tension that lingered. Lily looked up when she heard him enter, her face calm but serious. "Daddy," she said softly, "we've been talking, and we want to see her." Thomas froze, his heart beating faster. He hadn't expected this. He had thought that they might want to wait longer, or that they would choose not to see their mother at all. But now, here they were, making the decision for themselves. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded, her expression steady. "We want to know who she is, what happened. But we also want you to know that we don't want to leave you." Thomas looked at Grace, who was sitting quietly beside her sister. Grace's face was full of innocence, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes as well. Thomas knew that, in their own way, they were ready. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had been prepared to protect them, to shelter them from the pain of their past. But now, he realized that this was part of their healing process. "Okay," he said, his voice firm yet tender. "I'll make sure it's safe, and I'll be there with you. You're not alone in this." As he said the words, Thomas felt a sense of finality wash over him. It wasn't just about meeting their mother. It was about allowing them to take control of their own story. He had been their protector, but now, they were taking the next step. The next morning, they drove to the meeting place, a small, neutral location arranged by the social worker. The drive was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Lily held Grace's hand, her fingers wrapped around her sister's with a quiet sense of reassurance. Thomas sat in the front seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his own nerves. When they arrived, the social worker greeted them, and together, they walked into the room. It was a simple, clean space, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Their biological mother was already there, sitting on the other side of the room. She looked nervous, her hands twisting in her lap, but when she saw the girls, her face softened. Thomas remained standing by the door, watching from a distance. He knew this was something the girls had to face on their own, but he wasn't about to let them go through it without him there. Lily and Grace sat down across from their mother, their eyes meeting hers. There was a silence in the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of something unresolved, something yet to be said. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Why did you leave us?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, there was no answer. Their mother looked down, her eyes filling with tears. "I was lost," she whispered. "I didn't know how to take care of you, and I thought you'd be better off without me. I was wrong." The words were simple, but they held a weight that was impossible to ignore. Thomas stood at the door, his heart heavy as he watched the girls begin to process the conversation. They weren't just meeting their mother, they were meeting a part of their past that had haunted them for so long. And though the road ahead would be complicated, Thomas knew that this was a step forward. The girls weren't running from their past anymore. They were embracing it, learning from it, and ultimately, growing stronger because of it. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the encounter with their biological mother lingered in the background, like an unresolved chapter. Lily and Grace were adjusting, but there were moments when the past crept into their conversations. At night, Lily would sometimes lie awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Thomas would hear her, and in those quiet moments, he'd enter her room, sit by her side, and simply listen. Grace, on the other hand, had become more outgoing, her laughter filling the house with joy as she played with the neighborhood kids. But she too had her moments of doubt, moments when she clung to Thomas as though the world outside might swallow her whole. Despite their progress, there was an unease that Thomas couldn't shake. The girls were healing, but the scars of their past would always remain, and with them came the weight of decisions that were not his to make. One evening, as Thomas prepared dinner in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was the social worker. He had expected this call for weeks, but hearing it now, he couldn't help the rush of anxiety that flooded his chest. "Mr. Caldwell." The social worker's voice was calm but serious. "We've received new information regarding the girl's mother. She's seeking legal visitation rights." Thomas paused, his hands stilling on the knife in his hand. The weight of the words pressed down on him. He had anticipated the possibility, but hearing it made it all too real. What does this mean for them? Thomas asked, his voice steady, though the undercurrent of concern was unmistakable. It means that there will likely be a court process, the social worker explained. Lily and Grace will need to be involved in the proceedings. They have the right to have their voices heard. The conversation continued, but Thomas barely registered the words. His thoughts were on the girls, on their future. He thought about Lily's cautious nature, about Grace's warmth and vulnerability. He had promised them safety, stability, and love. But now, it seemed as though their past might tear it all apart. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Thomas sat in the living room, staring out the window. His mind raced, his heart conflicted. He had taken on this responsibility with no hesitation, and he had poured his heart into being the father they needed. But the reality of the situation was settling in. Could he really protect them from the uncertainty that lay ahead? He had always believed that love could overcome anything, but now, as the legal battle loomed, he wasn't sure that love alone would be enough. The next day, Thomas sat down with Lily and Grace, both of them sitting on the couch in front of him. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I need to talk to you both about something," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "There's a possibility that you may have to see your mother again. She's asking to have the right to visit you." Lily looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Why would she want to see us now?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion and hurt. Thomas's heart ached for her, for the way the past still haunted her. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he knew that the truth was the only path forward. "I don't know why, Lily, but I want you to know that you are safe with me. No matter what happens, I'm here. I will protect you." Grace, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, her small voice filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. "What will happen if we don't want to see her?" she asked. Thomas gently cupped her cheek, his eyes softening. "That's your choice. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We'll figure this out together, okay?" They both nodded, though there was a quiet uncertainty in their eyes. Thomas couldn't promise them an easy path ahead, but he could promise that they would face it as a family. And that, no matter what came next, they would never face it alone. The days leading up to the court hearing were filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear to Thomas. No matter what the outcome, his commitment to Lily and Grace would not waver. He spent more time with them, taking them to their favorite spots in the city, making sure they felt grounded and safe in their new life. Lily, who had always been cautious and unsure, had grown more confident, and Grace, despite her playful nature, had begun to understand the weight of their situation. She was asking more questions now, curious about the past, about why things had turned out the way they did. Thomas knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he could not shield them from everything. As much as he wanted to protect them from the pain of their past, he had to let them face it in their own way. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Thomas felt a sense of foreboding as he stood in front of the courthouse. The building loomed over him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to happen. He had been through countless meetings, negotiations, and high-stakes deals, but this was different. This was about their future, about their family. As they entered the courthouse, Lily and Grace held his hands tightly, their faces serious but calm. Thomas could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. He tried to reassure them with a smile, but inside, he was struggling. He had always been in control, but today, he was completely out of his element. The courtroom was packed, and the tension in the air was palpable. Lily and Grace sat beside him, their hands still clutching his, as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Their biological mother, who had insisted on seeing them, sat on the other side of the room, her face unreadable. Thomas tried not to look at her, but it was hard not to. She was the reason for all of this, the reason his life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. The legal proceedings began, and Thomas tried to focus, to stay present for the girls. The conversation shifted back and forth, the social worker speaking about Lily and Grace's well-being, their adjustment to their new life, and the impact that seeing their biological mother might have on them. It wasn't an easy conversation. Thomas could see the hurt in Lily's eyes as the discussion turned to their past, to the pain that had shaped their lives. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the memories that were now being dragged into the light. But he knew that this was something they had to face, together. The day stretched on, the courtroom filled with legal jargon and tense exchanges. But through it all, Thomas kept his focus on Lily and Grace. He held their hands tightly, reassuring them with quiet words when they needed it. He promised them that no matter what happened in that room, they would always be a family. As the judge finally gave his ruling, Thomas felt his heart race. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he was ready for whatever came next. The judge's voice echoed in the room, and when the verdict was finally read, it was clear the girls would remain with him. Their biological mother would have limited visitation rights, but the girls would not be forced to see her unless they were ready. A wave of relief washed over Thomas as he looked at Lily and Grace, their eyes wide, uncertain, but relieved. It wasn't the clean, easy resolution he had hoped for, but it was a step forward. And for the first time, as he held them close, he felt a deep sense of peace. This was his family now, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The weeks following the court decision felt like a new chapter, but the scars of the past were not easily forgotten. Thomas had kept his promise to Lily and Grace, assuring them they were safe, loved, and part of a family that was stronger than ever. But even as they settled into their new routine, there was an underlying tension, something that had yet to be fully healed. Lily and Grace had both become more confident, but the specter of their biological mother's return loomed over them. It wasn't that they resented the idea of seeing her again. Rather, it was the uncertainty that still hung in the air. Grace had started to ask more questions, her childlike curiosity creeping into their daily conversations. "Do you think she really loves us?" Grace had asked one evening, as they sat on the couch together, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light on her innocent face. It was a question that caught Thomas off guard. He had thought that they were past the emotional complexity of their past, but here they were again, facing the reality that the past would always be a part of them. "I don't know, sweetheart," Thomas had replied, his voice soft but firm. "But what I do know is that I love you, and you are my family now. You're safe with me, and that's all that matters." Lily, ever the quiet observer, had simply nodded in agreement. It wasn't that she didn't care about their biological mother. It was just that she had learned to place her trust in the family she had now, the family she had chosen. And Thomas could see that. As the months passed, they settled into a rhythm. Thomas continued to support the girls as they navigated their feelings, never rushing them, never forcing them to confront anything they weren't ready for. He had learned the hard way that healing took time and patience. But life had a way of testing his resolve. One afternoon, as Thomas was at the office, he received a call that would change everything. It was from the social worker. "Mr. Caldwell, there's been a development," the social worker said, her voice serious. "Your daughter's biological mother has requested another meeting. She's asking for more time with them." Thomas's heart sank. He had known this might happen, but hearing it now felt like a blow. He had thought that the boundaries had been set, that they had reached a point where the past was behind them. But now, it seemed that everything was in motion again, and he was left with more decisions to make. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What does this mean for them?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside. "It means that they will need to decide again, Mr. Caldwell," the social worker replied. "They have the right to choose whether or not to see her." The conversation ended, but the weight of the decision lingered. As Thomas hung up the phone, he looked out the window, the city skyline stretching before him. He knew that whatever happened, his daughters would need him more than ever. The next evening, after dinner, Thomas sat down with Lily and Grace. They were both quieter than usual, sensing the change in the air. "I need to talk to you both about something," Thomas began. He could see the concern in their eyes. "Your mom has asked to meet with you again. It's up to you, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will support you." There was a long silence before Lily spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "I don't want to go," she said. Grace looked at her sister, then at Thomas. "Me neither," she said softly. "I don't think I'm ready." Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest as he looked at the two girls. He had been worried, unsure of how they would react. But in that moment, he knew they were strong. They had found their place in the world, and they were not defined by their past. "That's okay," Thomas said gently, his voice full of love and reassurance. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. You are safe here, and that's all that matters." The decision had been made. not in a court of law, but in the quiet, trusting space between them. It wasn't about what had happened in the past. It was about what they had now, what they had built together. As he hugged them both, Thomas knew one thing for certain. The family they had created was unbreakable. They had each other, and together, they could face whatever the future held. Months passed, and the decision to remain distant from their biological mother seemed to be the right one for Lily and Grace. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The bond between them and Thomas had only deepened, with each day that passed affirming the foundation they had built together. The girls were thriving in their new environment. Lily, once quiet and reserved, now spoke her mind more often, and Grace, who had once been filled with apprehension, laughed more freely. They had become not just his responsibility, but his source of joy and purpose. Thomas had always been a man who thrived on control, on making things happen, on seeing results. But this was different. He was learning that the most meaningful things in life could not be controlled, could not be dictated by his achievements. The past had shaped them, yes, but it did not define them. They were forging their own path now. Together, one warm spring afternoon, as the family sat together in the living room, a moment of quiet reflection filled the space between them. Thomas watched as Lily helped Grace with a puzzle, the two of them working side by side with laughter and chatter filling the air. Thomas sat back, a smile tugging at his lips. It was a peaceful scene, one he never thought possible after everything they had been through. But this was his family. And he was no longer the same man who had walked into that hospital months ago, unsure and uncertain. He had been reborn, not just by his actions, but by the love and trust that had been given to him. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, Grace suddenly looked up from her plate and spoke, breaking the silence. "Daddy, do you think we'll ever see her again?" It was a simple question, but it held so much weight. For a moment, Thomas didn't know how to answer. He had spent so much time shielding them from the past, from the painful memories that still haunted their hearts. But now, as Grace's eyes met his, filled with innocence and vulnerability, he knew that it was time to face the truth, both for them and for himself. "I don't know," Thomas replied honestly, his voice steady but thoughtful. "What I do know is that you two are my world, and nothing will change that. No matter what happens in the future, I will always be here, protecting you." Grace smiled softly, content with his answer. Lily, who had been quietly listening, nodded as well, her gaze thoughtful. The conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but Thomas could feel the shift. It was subtle but significant. They had come to a place where the past no longer held power over them. They were stronger now, not just because of what they had endured, but because of what they had built together. And as the evening wore on, with laughter and chatter filling the house, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had found his family, and he would fight to keep them safe, no matter what. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but Thomas had learned that the love and strength they shared would carry them through. They were no longer just survivors of their past. They were a family, united and whole, and nothing could take that away. As time went on, the sense of peace that Thomas had fought so hard for seemed to settle deeper into their lives. The bond between him, Lily, and Grace had only grown stronger, and the weight of their past began to feel more like a distant memory. They had moved on, not because the past had disappeared, but because they had learned how to live with it, how to build something new out of the fragments of their old lives. They spent more time together, taking trips to the park, cooking meals, and creating a home filled with laughter and warmth. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. One bright Saturday morning, as they sat around the breakfast table, Grace suddenly looked up, her eyes bright. "Daddy," she said, her voice full of excitement, "can we go to the zoo today?" Thomas chuckled, wiping his hands on a napkin. He had come to realize that these were the moments that made life worth living, the small, ordinary moments that filled the days with joy. "Of course," he said with a smile. "Let's go see the animals." They spent the day at the zoo, laughing and exploring, their spirits light and carefree. It was the kind of day that made them all feel like everything was as it should be, perfectly imperfect. That evening, as they all sat together on the couch, watching a movie, Thomas realized just how far they had come. The girls were no longer the scared, uncertain children he had found on that cold night under the bridge. They were vibrant, happy, and full of life. They had grown so much, and so had he. He had learned that being a parent was not about having all the answers, but about being there, supporting them through their struggles, and loving them unconditionally. The following week, Thomas received a letter from the social worker. It was official. The legal process regarding their biological mother had been finalized. The girls were under his full custody, and the decision to limit their mother's visitation rights had been upheld. The past was now behind them, and they could finally move forward without fear of uncertainty hanging over their heads. As Thomas read the letter, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. This chapter of their lives had come to a close, and while it had been difficult, it had also been necessary. It was a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. That night, after tucking Lily and Grace into bed, Thomas sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything they had been through. He had been afraid, uncertain, but now, as he sat in the quiet of the house, he realized that he had built something beautiful, a family. He was no longer the man he had been when he first met Lily and Grace. He had found something more valuable than all the wealth and success he had worked for. He had found love, connection, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that he had done right by them. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He knew that together, they could face whatever came their way. As the soft sound of the girls' breathing filled the house, Thomas smiled to himself. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, it felt like the road was theirs to walk together. And that was enough. In this heartfelt journey of a millionaire CEO who unexpectedly becomes the father to two young sisters, these touching stories reveal the deep emotional transformation that comes with love, responsibility, and the power of second chances. Through every trial and tribulation, from the cold streets to a warm home, the bond between the girls and their new father grows stronger with each passing day. These touching stories illustrate the importance of choosing family, even when the past is difficult to confront. As Thomas navigates the ups and downs of fatherhood, he discovers that the true meaning of success isn't in wealth, but in the love and connection shared with those who matter most. With touching stories about healing, trust, and growth, this tale highlights the emotional journey of overcoming hardship and embracing new beginnings. Witness how these touching stories unfold as the characters face the past, make difficult decisions, and ultimately create a family built on love, support, and understanding. Through all of it, the touching stories remind us that family is not just about blood, but about the bond we choose to create, and the love that grows stronger every day.